It starts with a house clearance. A family in rural England going through the belongings of a woman who died alone. Boxes of clothes, stacks of old magazines, a kettle still plugged in on the kitchen counter, and tucked inside a hollowed out Bible on the top shelf of a wardrobe, a diary. Not one diary, 11. 11 notebooks, spanning 11 years, written in the same careful handwriting, right up to 3 weeks before she died. They assumed it was personal, grief maybe, memories, the kind of thing you skim out of respect and then seal in a bag for the charity shop. But one of her daughters started reading, and what she found inside those notebooks would reopen a closed murder case, expose a man who had been living freely for over a decade, and raise a question that nobody in that courtroom could fully answer. How do you prosecute a crime when the only witness is already dead? The woman's name was Margaret Alford. She was 71 years old when she died of heart failure in a home in Shropshire, England, in March 2019. To the people who knew her casually, neighbors, the woman at the post office, the volunteers at her church, she was quiet, private, a woman who had lived through something terrible and never quite come back from it. What they knew, or thought they knew, was this. In 2007, Margaret's husband, Raymond Alford, had been killed. He was found at the bottom of the staircase in their home. The official verdict at the time was accidental death, a fall, a man in his late 50s with a known heart condition and a history of heavy drinking. The coroner's report was clean. The case was closed. Margaret had given a statement to police. She said she had been asleep when it happened. She heard a sound. She came downstairs and found him. Nobody questioned her. And for 12 years, Raymond Alford's death remained exactly what the coroner said it was. An accident, a tragedy, a closed file, until her daughter opened that Bible. The first notebook begins in 2008, 1 year after Raymond's death. The handwriting is neat at first, controlled. The early entries read almost like a normal journal, weather, the garden, what she had for dinner. But threaded through all of it, from the very first pages, are references to a man named Colin Greaves. He is mentioned by name almost immediately. Colin came again today. I told him not to, but he came anyway. And then, a few entries later, Colin says if I ever tell anyone, he will make sure they know what I did. I don't know what he means. I think I do. By the second notebook, the picture starts to come into focus. Colin Greaves was not a stranger. He was a former business associate of Raymond's. The two men had known each other for years, going back to a shared logistics venture in the late 1990s that had made both of them reasonably comfortable. They had fallen out badly in 2005 over a disputed payment, a figure somewhere north of £40,000, depending on who you believed, and the falling out had been ugly. Solicitors were involved, threats were made. By 2006, they were not speaking. And according to the diary, Colin Greaves had been inside the Alford house on the night Raymond died. Margaret had not told the police that. The question that dominates the next three notebooks is not whether she knew what happened. It is whether she was a witness, a participant, or something far more complicated than either of those words allows. What the diaries describe entry by entry across more than a decade, is a woman trapped inside a story she could not escape. She does not, in any of the 11 notebooks, say directly what happened on the staircase. She never writes it in plain language, but she circles it constantly. She approaches it, backs away, returns. She writes around it the way you walk around something broken on the floor in the dark, aware of exactly where it is, without ever looking at it directly. What she does write, clearly and repeatedly, is this: Colin Greaves knew something, and he used it. The diary describes a sustained campaign of what can only be called coercion. He would appear at her door without warning. He would call at night. He reminded her regularly that he had been in that house, that he knew things, that if she ever spoke to anyone, police, family, a solicitor, he would tell his version of events first. His version, as Margaret understood it, implicate her. She writes, "He said Raymond's death was not an accident, and that I know that. He said we both know that. I think he means to say we were both there. But I was not the one. I was not the one who did anything. I was standing at the top of the stairs, and I saw." She never finishes that sentence. That incomplete entry, written on a Tuesday afternoon in November 2011, would become the single most discussed piece of evidence in the trial that followed. Margaret Alford lived with this for 11 years. Think about what that means. Every morning she woke up inside a house where something had happened. Every time the phone rang at an unexpected hour, she knew who it might be. She never remarried. She barely left Shropshire. Her daughters later told the court that she had become increasingly withdrawn from around 2009 onwards, that she would sometimes refuse to answer the door, that she flinched at certain sounds, that she had taken to leaving the television on all night because she didn't like the silence. They thought it was grief. It was not grief. Not only grief. It was a woman who knew something she believed she could never say out loud. She kept writing instead. The diaries are not a confession. They are not a formal witness statement. What they are is something harder to categorize, a decade of testimony that nobody was ever supposed to read, written by a woman who understood, on some level, that one day they might be. Because here is a detail that changes everything. Margaret Alford did not simply write these diaries and hide them. She arranged for them to be found. Her youngest daughter, Claire, told the court that when they were clearing the house, she found a handwritten note tucked into the front cover of the hollowed Bible, not inside the diaries, on top of them, written recently, the ink still sharp, the paper still white against the yellowed notebooks beneath it. It said, "Read these, all of them, then decide what to do." I couldn't. Maybe you can. I'm sorry. That was it. No name, no date. But it was her handwriting. Claire recognized it immediately. Margaret Alford had decided, at some point before she died, that she would not take this to the grave. She could not make the call herself. She had lived too long inside the silence, but she could leave a door open for someone else to walk through. Claire read the first diary in one sitting. She called her sister. They read the rest together over 2 days, stopping frequently, going back over entries, sitting with things they didn't understand and things they understood too well. And then they called the police. What followed was one of the most unusual investigations Shropshire police had conducted in years. The original 2007 case file was pulled from storage. Raymond Alford's death had been classified as accidental based primarily on three things: the coroner's conclusion that the injuries were consistent with a fall, the absence of any identified witnesses, and Margaret's own statement that she had been asleep upstairs. Two of those three pillars had now collapsed entirely. The diaries put Margaret at the top of the staircase, and the diaries put Colin Greaves inside the house. Detectives reopened the case formally in October 2019, 7 months after Margaret's death. By that point, Colin Greaves was 67 years old. He had moved twice since 2007, first to Leeds, then to a village outside Bristol. He had remarried in 2013. He attended a local golf club. He had, by all external appearances, built a comfortable second chapter of his life on top of a chapter he had never acknowledged. He was arrested at his home on a Wednesday morning in November 2019. His wife answered the door. She stood in the hallway in her dressing gown while officers led her husband to the car, and she told journalists later that the look on his face when they mentioned Raymond Alford's name was the moment she understood that she did not know the man she had married as well as she thought she did. His initial response to police was calm, almost dismissive. He said he had nothing to do with Raymond Alford's death and that he barely remembered the man. When detectives placed the diaries on the table in front of him, all 11 notebooks stacked in order, he looked at them for a long moment. Then he said, "That woman was not well. She hadn't been well for years." It was the wrong thing to say. It told detectives almost everything they needed to know about the defense strategy they were about to face. The case that went to trial at Shrewsbury Crown Court in June 2021 was built almost entirely on the diaries, and that presented an immediate and serious legal problem. Margaret Alford was dead. She could not be cross-examined. She could not be asked to clarify what she meant by an unfinished sentence in November 2011. She could not be challenged on her memory, her state of mind, her relationship with Raymond, or her motivations for writing what she wrote and hiding it where she hid it. The defense argued from the very first day that the diaries were inadmissible, that they were the uncorroborated writings of a deceased woman with a documented history of anxiety and depression, whose account could not be tested in court and whose documents had been deliberately concealed for over a decade before being strategically revealed by family members with an emotional interest in the outcome. It was not an unreasonable argument, and the judge, His Honor Judge Peter Calloway, took 3 days to consider it before ruling. He admitted the diaries. His reasoning was precise. The diaries were not being presented as a confession or a formal witness account. They were being admitted as documented evidence of a pattern of conduct, specifically the sustained intimidation carried out by Colin Greaves against a person he believed could place him at the scene of a death. Their internal consistency across 11 years, the specificity of dates and references that could be cross-checked against phone records and other documentation, and the manner in which they had been preserved and deliberately left to be found, all spoke to their reliability as a contemporaneous record. He also noted something the prosecution had flagged in their submission. Across the 11 notebooks, Margaret Alford referenced 37 specific visits or calls from Colin Greaves. Telephone records obtained by detectives confirmed contact between Greaves and a landline registered to the Alford address on 29 of those dates. The diaries were not simply a private account. They were corroborated, point by point, by the phone company's own records. The defense had no answer for that. What the jury then heard, across 3 weeks of testimony, was the contents of all 11 notebooks read aloud in court, entry by entry, year by year. A woman's voice filling a room she had never entered. The courtroom was completely silent for most of it. Jurors took notes. Several of them visibly struggled during the entries where the exhaustion became impossible to miss, the entries where the handwriting loosened, where she wrote things like, "I'm so tired of being frightened," and "I think he will only stop when I'm gone." And in the final notebook, written 8 days before she was hospitalized, "I have done everything wrong, and I have done one thing right, and I don't know if it will matter." The prosecution described it as the longest witness statement ever delivered in that courtroom. They were not wrong. The forensic case, rebuilt from a 12-year-old scene, was always going to be limited. There was no physical evidence preserved from 2007, no retained biological samples, no detailed forensic photography beyond the standard scene documentation. The house had been sold in 2014. Another family had lived in it for 5 years. Whatever the staircase might once have told investigators, it was long gone. What forensic experts could offer was a reanalysis of the original coroner's photographs using modern imaging enhancement techniques. Dr. Helen Marsh, a forensic pathologist called by the prosecution, testified that having reviewed the original injury documentation, she could not rule out that certain of Raymond Alford's injuries were inconsistent with a simple unassisted fall. She was precise and careful in her language. She did not say he had been pushed. She said the distribution of impact injuries across his upper back and the base of his skull suggested a trajectory that was, in her professional opinion, more consistent with a body that had been projected forward than one that had simply lost balance and fallen. She used the word ambiguous 3 times in her testimony. The physical case was thin, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. The defense brought their own pathologist, Dr. Andrew Sefton, who testified that the injuries were entirely consistent with a fall in a man Raymond Alford's age and physical condition. Expert against expert. Ambiguous against ambiguous. The diaries were still carrying almost all of the weight. Colin Greaves took the stand in the 3rd week of the trial. He admitted for the first time publicly that he had been in the Alford house on the night Raymond died. He said he had gone there uninvited late in the evening to confront Raymond about the money one final time. He said Raymond had answered the door already drunk. He said they argued in the hallway, and then at the bottom of the stairs, he said Raymond was aggressive, pointing his finger, getting close, and he said that at some point during the argument, Raymond had turned to go back upstairs, lost his footing on the 2nd step, and fallen. He said he had not touched him. He said he panicked. He left without calling an ambulance because he knew how it would look. A man with a documented financial dispute with the deceased, found at the scene of his death in a house he had no right to be in. He said he drove home and told himself Raymond would be found by morning and that it would be ruled what it eventually was ruled. An accident. And here is where his testimony fell apart. The prosecutor, a woman named Sarah Tennant QC, let him finish. Then she opened the 7th notebook and read him an entry from April 2014. In it, Margaret describes Greaves arriving at her door at 11 o'clock at night, standing in her kitchen, and telling her that if she ever spoke to her daughters about what happened, he would go to the police himself and tell them she had been having an affair with him and that Raymond had found out that same night. She asked Greaves whether that sounded like mutual protection. He said Margaret had misunderstood him. She read him another entry, and another. She read him 7 entries across 4 notebooks, each one describing a specific threat, each one dated, each one corroborated by the phone records already in evidence. He said Margaret had been confused, that she was unwell, that she had a tendency to catastrophize. Sarah Tennant let the silence sit for a moment. Then she asked him one final question. If Margaret Alford was confused and unwell, why had he been calling her at 11 o'clock at night for 12 consecutive years? He had no answer that held together. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon in September 2021. Colin Greaves was found guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The jury could not be satisfied on the evidence available of the specific intent required for a murder conviction. The gap in the physical evidence was too wide. The reasonable doubt was real. But manslaughter, the unlawful killing of Raymond Alford through an act that, whatever its precise nature, was not the accident Greaves had allowed the world to believe it was for 14 years. He was also convicted on a separate charge of harassment covering the period between 2008 and 2019. 11 years of documented contact designed to keep a frightened woman silent. He was sentenced to 14 years for the manslaughter, a further 3 years to run consecutively for the harassment. He would not be eligible for parole consideration for over 11 years. He showed no visible reaction as the sentence was read. Outside the court, Claire Alford spoke briefly to the press. She said she was relieved, but that relief was not simple. Her mother had carried this alone for 11 years, had never told her daughters, had protected them by keeping them in the dark, and had protected herself by keeping a record that she ultimately trusted them to act on. She was the bravest person I have ever known, Claire said. And I wish she had told us. I wish she had known that we could have handled it. The questions this case left behind are not comfortable ones. Margaret Alford saw something at the top of a staircase in 2007. Her incomplete diary entry. I was standing at the top of the stairs and I saw was never finished. We do not know with certainty what she saw. We do not know whether Colin Greaves acted alone or whether the full truth was more complicated than the verdict captured. But that unfinished sentence is real, and the jury felt the weight of it, and so does anyone who reads those 11 notebooks from beginning to end. The second question is about what the diaries themselves represent. Margaret spent 11 years writing a record she simultaneously concealed and preserved. She created a document trail more detailed and more corroborated than most living witnesses managed to produce. She arranged with a 4-word note for it to function as testimony after her death. In a very real sense, she built the prosecution's entire case from inside a house she never felt safe enough to leave. Whether that was courage or guilt or something that contains both simultaneously, there is no clean answer. There rarely is. The third question is the one that sits heaviest. The system that was supposed to find the truth in 2007 did not look hard enough. The police accepted a simple explanation because one was available. They did not ask why a widow seemed frightened in the weeks after her husband's death. They did not follow up. They filed the paperwork and moved on. And a man walked out of that house, drove to Leeds, rebuilt his life, remarried, joined a golf club, and spent 12 years making sure a woman too frightened to speak stayed that way. She wrote anyway. Every time he knocked on that door, every time the phone rang in the dark, every time he stood in her kitchen and reminded her of what he could do, she went back to those notebooks and she wrote it down. Date, time, what he said, what she felt, what she couldn't bring herself to finish. Margaret Alford was 71 years old. She cleared a space on a shelf inside a hollowed Bible, stacked 11 notebooks into it, wrote 4 words on a piece of paper, and trusted that someone she loved would find it and do what she had spent 11 years being too afraid to do herself. She was right. What do you think? Did the verdict reflect the truth of what actually happened in that house? And was justice served? Or did it arrive 11 years too late to mean what it should? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And that is all for today. Thanks for watching.